Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 117. To ask questions in an anonymous form, please write to us at meaningfullife.com/mylife. Also, I ask you to all subscribe to the YouTube channel that's now designated specific to this called MyLife. Simply helps us focus these programs and help it grow and help it not necessarily get involved and mixed with other videos that we do. So please do that. As you know, these are also all available now on through iTunes, which you can download. And all that information you can find at meaningfullife.com/mylife, where you have all the landing page that offers all the aspects of this ongoing and growing program, which I have to thank all of you for listening to, for participating, for your comments, your questions. And I would never have believed when we began over 2 years ago that this would continue to go. The questions keep coming in. And when you could think that sometimes you may run out of questions, it doesn't seem so. Just like life continues to roll on and each of us have our challenges, new questions come in, very intriguing ones that I never thought of, and that forced me to go ahead with my team to go and research and look deeper into Chassidus to find answers. And we'll be dealing with some of them in this episode as we do each week. I just wanted to just, from time to time, just sum up the purpose of this and mission and focus of MyLife Chassidus Applied. It is, as its name says implicitly, it is to apply Chassidus. Now, there are people who have asked the question, why do we need to apply Chassidus? What's the Chiddush here? There's actually no real Chiddush. It is the whole purpose of what Chassidus was given to us for, is to be applied. And to put it in simple Hebrew, it would be not just to learn the Haskalah, the ideas and philosophy of Chassidus, but to apply it and bring it into action called Avodah. So this isn't some type of new age or some type of diluted or bastardized version of Chassidus, God forbid. People have suggested that, I'm not suggesting that they're talking about this program, but suggested that any type of discussions of this nature is somewhat not pure Chassidus. On the absolute contrary, as I discussed at the beginning of the outset of this series back when we started around Chav Dalet Tevis 2 years ago, which we did Tov Shinai Daled, that the Rebbe in the Kuntis and Yon Shateres Chassidus has in chapter 18 there a footnote which really captures the whole idea that the ultimate essence, the etzem of Panimius Atik, of the deepest dimension of Chassidus, is seen where? When you see its application in our personal lives. So this isn't about some self-help or trying to make Chassidus have some ulterior motives that why Chassidus is good for me. On the contrary, when it's good for you, which means it helps your life, it helps deal with challenges and situations, you're actually revealing the essential power of Chassidus. So Chassidus is based on bittul, yes, that's correct. But bittul is part of the process. What is necessary for us to grow is to have bittul. For us necessary to fulfill the calling and mission of our lives and dedicate itself requires that and many other factors. But the idea to suggest that Chassidus, applying Chassidus to our lives is some type of selfish endeavor, God forbid, is the whole purpose of Tanya. Tanya says he wants it to be Eitzes and Avedis Hashem. And Aveda means bringing it into some form of application to our personal lives, whether it's Ben Adam L'Chavere, between one another, one person and another person, or Ben Adam L'Mokim, between us and God. There's more to say on this. If you go back to the first episode, I discussed this in the second episode, because whenever you begin something, you always want to establish its foundational elements. But I wanted to emphasize it because, yes, there may be people who are trying to create a new age type of Chassidus or some other self-help version of it, etc., etc. And I want to emphasize that the purpose here is the exact opposite. It's to take Chassidus in its purest form, which is the original sources from all the Rabbeim, and find ways to apply it to our lives that are relevant, in our particular issues. With the whole intensity. To say Chassidus is so holy, Tanya Kadisha, that it can't be relevant to our lives, is that itself is the ultimate desecration and insult to the Rabbeim and to what the Alter Rebbe states in his introduction to Tanya, and all the Maimonic Chassidus and all the investment and the Mesiras Nefesh of the Rabbeim to turn it into something that is so abstract or so holy that, God forbid, that we can't apply it to our lives. The exact opposite is true. And go back to Kundus and Yonash Chassidus, the basics, where the Rebbe explains how do you reconcile the fact then that if Teda Shashuim Lefonov, which means it's God's delights, God's most intimate delights, how then can we use it as something that is helping us? He brings there the question with the Gemara that talks about that the Barasile Yisrahara, Barasile Teda Tavlin. How could you call Teda Tavlin, which is a spice, some type of like almost a secondary element, just to spice something, in order to deal with the Yetzer Hara? All this is discussed there and other places. So this is the basis of what we're doing here, which is taking Chassidus Betarose within its purest form, in its original source, and trying to apply it in different conditions and situations that we all deal with. And what greater tribute is that to the Rabbeim? And above all this, what better way to prepare for the Geula Amitis Vashlema, which is a time when we will be living most aligned to exactly the way God planned for us is. Mola Oris Deus Hashem, the world will be filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. And that will be the primary activity, because we will be aligned with both our minds, our hearts, and our actions. Our cognitive, emotional, and behavioral mechanisms will all be aligned with the way we were intended to be in fulfilling our purpose. So learning Chassidus does exactly that. Okay. Now, let's go to the questions here. Let's begin with, obviously, something connected to our time. This week is Parshas Bechukosai in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel. It will be Parshas Bamidbar in Eretz Yisrael. So let me share a few thoughts on that, as well as the fact that it's also Shabbas Mevarchim Sivan. The Shabbos will be Shabbas Mevarchim Sivan, the Shabbos that blesses the new month of Sivan, which is the month, of course, the third month, Chedesh HaShlishi, the month of Matan Torah. So beginning with Bechukosai, I'll be talking some more about this actually more later in the episode, in this week's episode, regarding the Chassidus question, which is around the Parsha Bechukosai and the Likutei Torah of that Parsha. But in addition to that, one of the key focuses, one of the most popular verses, if you can say, one of the most used verses of the Rebbe was Im Bechukosai Tilechu, V'esmesmesi Tishmeru, V'nasati Gishmeichem Be'itam. Which means that when you will follow, you will walk in the ways of Bechukosai, the laws, and protect and fulfill the mitzvahs, V'nasati Gishmeichem Be'itam. I will give you the reins in time. The Baal Shem Tov teaches Gishmeichem, also from the word Gashmis. I'll bless you with all the Gashmisdik needs that we have in this world, which of course also makes it more applicable to our time, because Gishmeichem, rain, many can say, in the times when there were famines or certain parts of the world, especially Eretz Yisrael, Gishmeichem was the key sustenance, and that's why we pray for water every day, and it's based on the prayers that we say starting from Shmini Atzeres, when we begin the Birchas Hamayim and Birchas Hageshem, which is a discussion of its own. So there is a blessing, because rain is what sustains the fields, which is sustains our and gives us the produce and the grain and the foods that we eat. So even though that's necessary today as well, but when you broaden it and say it's also Geshmeichem from the word Gashmias, that means that it's directly dependent on Bechukosai Tilech, and how the Rebbe uses it in a very simple and direct way. As I said before, when you align yourself, the question obviously is, what's the connection? Is it some zgula? God says, you do my mitzvahs, I'll bless you. No, because when you do mitzvahs, which comes from the word hatzavse v'chibur, connecting, and the opposite of aveda, which means to disconnect, and aveda from the word displacement, and disalignment or misalignment. So because when you align yourself and you follow that path, meaning, to put it in simple English, that the machine called life, the machine called you as an individual, follows the cosmic engineer's operator's manual for life, which is called the Torah Bechukosai Tilechu, and it's mitzvesi tishmeru, then that is the natural way, siba mesuv, cause and effect, because when you behave in a healthy way, you then have healthy blessings in your life. Just like, for example, a person who eats the proper foods, in the physical sense of the word, and exercises properly, and does what's necessary for the body to be as healthy as possible, what will happen? It draws the soul's energy and the life energy and the life force into the human being. God forbid when the opposite is done, and there's some type of toxicity or pollutants, or not eating the right foods or not exercising properly, what will happen is simply the body will not be able to draw that energy, and God forbid, disease or illness enters into the picture. So it's more than just a sgula, like a so-called sgula means not directly connected. God says, you do this, I'll give you a reward. It's not that. The reward is schar mitzvah. The mitzvah itself is a reward because the mitzvah connects you. And when a person is connected and their spiritual oxygen is entering, then your gashmis, your physical life, is far healthier. So that's how the Rebbe interprets in many, many notes and answers and yechidus and farbrengens, where the Rebbe would quote this pasuk, always in saying how Torah mitzvahs is not just what God wants us to do, but it's also the best way to live your life. Because it's the best way to have gashmis and to have the blessings that one needs in their personal lives. Another Torah Bechukosai telechu, which is from the word Chassidus, Likutei Torah says Bechukosai from the word chukah chakakti, from the word chakakti chakika, which is engraving. Famous story when they did a Psim Sefer Torah in Chicago, and it was with the Frierdiker Rebbe, and one of the Frierdiker Rebbe shluchim, Rabbonim, that spoke there, spoke about the idea of how each Jew is a letter in the Torah. And like a written letter in the Torah. And the Frierdiker Rebbe corrected him and says like an engraved letter in the Torah. The difference Chassidus explains between Eisi Sachkika and Eisi Saksiva, when you write something on parchment, even a Sefer Torah, the ink and the parchment are two substances which you combine, and later it could be erased. That's why you sometimes have. It gets cracked off or scratched off. When you engrave something into stone, an engraving is part of the stone. You're not superimposing another substance. So what can happen is dust, debris, and other things can fill up the engraved letters, but it always remains there. And all you have to do is remove the dust. The Rebbe once wrote to us in a sikha that he edited. He wrote, "Dust can be read as da sitra achra," which is an expression in Zohar. Da sitra achra, dust da sitra achra. Dal aleph samach tes. So dust is the sitra achra, is the other side, but it does not fundamentally change the stone. All it does is cover up, which it's a whole different lesson than what you tell a person when it's Bechukosai, chikike, chukah chakakti, that you are fundamentally connected. The only thing is there's sometimes a dust or something, other substance that can cover up. So you got to blow off the dust, or you have to do what's necessary to clean off the dust, and then your natural personality emerges. Again, the focus being that this is who you are. The nature of the person is such. The nature of the Jew is such, as he says in the Rambam says in the end of chapter 2 of Hilchos Gerushin, in Mishnah Torah, that when he talks about how could you force him to say, I want? He could always say, you forced me, I didn't really mean it. So he says, no, it's the Yetzer Hara that forces you to say you don't want. And when when the Torah forces you, when the Torah says, one should be forced, it's only to get rid of the Yetzer Hara's having captivated you and captured you in its clutches, and to free you from that, to reveal your real Ratzon, which is the Ratzon of a Jew, is to do mitzvahs and to laharchik and to distance yourself from Avedas. So this is far deeper than just we do what God wants us to do, which of course is the basis of it, but it means that we are wired in a certain way, and that when you do it this way, your wiring and your being becomes more enriched in your life. So it's a richer life and a more healthier life, both spiritually and physically, geshmechem, to live up to this, all hinted to live up to the derech of Torah and mitzvahs, all hinted to in one verse in its letters, Bechukosai. Okay. As far as Shabbas Mevarchim, let me share a little history that many people don't know. We know that the Rebbe often would say, and did farbring every Shabbas Mevarchim, even in the earlier years where there was not a farbring in every Shabbos. For many years there wasn't. It was only in the last years that Rebbe started farbringen every Shabbos. But Shabbos Mevarchim was always a farbringen, and it was, as he said, takone. This was the Frierdiker Rebbe had given him a direct instruction, the Rebbe that is, to farbring Shabbos Mevarchim. But where was this instruction given? Most people are not familiar with the history. The history goes that in 770, when the Rebbe came Tafshin Aleph, which would be 1941, coming up to the anniversary soon, Chavches Sivan Tafshin Aleph, as is known, the Rebbe barely got out with the Rebbe and Chaim Mushke from Portugal, the boat going to New York. So the Frierdiker Rebbe, when he came, the Frierdiker Rebbe, of course, gave the Rebbe the job, which we know, head of Merkez L'Inyanei Chinuch, the head of Machne Yisrael, head of Kohos, and that was the Rebbe's work. There was a gabbai in 770, upstairs 770. The Frierdiker Rebbe would daven on the second floor where he lived. But downstairs in 770, downstairs meaning what is now upstairs, the first floor, when you walk in on the first floor, the smaller shul, where the Rebbe davened in the earlier years, where the Farbrengens were, until it became not large enough. So there was a minyan every Shabbos. The minyan was run by a gabbai whose name was Rabbi Roth. And Rabbi Roth was a Apathy Shid from the neighborhood, and that's what he ran. Frierdiker Rebbe the Frierdiker Rebbe encouraged him that he should make a kiddush, and get people more besedus, and have. So he said to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe said to him, especially Shabbas Mevarchim, make a kiddush every Shabbas Mevarchim, and have people come and sit and talk and farbring and take on achlotas, resolutions and so on. He says that people are not going to come. Right after davening, they're going to just leave. So the Frierdiker Rebbe told him, I will tell my son-in-law that he should farbring Shabbos Mevarchim. And Frierdiker Rebbe at that point gave Rabbi Roth $3, $3. That's the shtatfus to begin these kiddushim on Shabbos Mevarchim. And the Rebbe, then the Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe, that's when the takana began. So began connected to beginning a kiddush, and to start gathering Jews, that Jews should come at least Shabbos Mevarchim and stay after davening and farbring a bit. So I just thought it's good to share that. In addition to that, we spoke about Shabbos Mevarchim and some of the customs. So I might as well use this opportunity to just follow up, because there were a few questions asked. We talked about someone had asked the question, if he doesn't have the time to say Tilim and to do all the things that it says in Yem Yem and the Minhagim that we should do on Shabbos Mevarchim. So maybe let's use this moment to do some follow-up on that matter. Follow-up on that is Shabbos Mevarchim. So one question to write. So I discussed then that to be practical, case by case, and if you can't do something, you can't finish the Tilim in the morning, and so on. So you say as much as you can, and then you say it later. Talked about a farbring. The Rebbe says in Yem Yem there's to farbring an hour. To learn Chassidus before davening, and then farbring afterwards. So the question was, how do you balance all of that? And I gave my suggestions at the time. So here's some comments on those suggestions. You mentioned on your last episode that one should skip Chassidus or learn for 5 minutes and daven with a minyan on Shabbos Mevarchim, since there isn't enough time in between. How does this fit with the Rebbe's advice in Yem Yem to learn an hour in between? Doesn't the Rebbe want and expect us to prepare for Shachris properly with Chassidus every day, even on Shabbos Mevarchim? I was always under the impression that preparing for a proper Shachris is more important than Tefillah B'tzibur, which is davening with a minyan, and that one should just try to answer Amen, Baruch Hu, and Kaddish. Question 2, which is similar. To question 1, thank you so much for addressing my question regarding Shabbos Mevarchim. I'd like to reference you to Yem Yem, which has been the source of my frustration, which is Yem Yem of Shabbos Kislev 26, second day of Chanukah. And that's where he talks about these details of how to use out this day. And he says, the Rebbe clearly writes we're supposed to learn our Chassidus, not just 5 minutes. And from your answer on the last episode, are you advocating that this doesn't apply or need to be done, and one should skip the hour of Chassidus and down with the tzibur, then go to the farbrengen? I particularly am a slow Tehillim reader and can't even finish it in the allotted time of 1.5 hours that most shuls give. When I look around, most people can't either. If I wake up very early, then I'm tired and the whole day becomes a long, miserable experience. Is this a Yem Yem really something that most people can handle? He writes more details about this thing and how to approach it. Let me see. Okay. So briefly, no, I'm not, God forbid, am I here to overrule or change what the Rebbe says or suggests or advocates. What I said was based on 2 things. First of all, many answers that the Rebbe gave to people, which I really didn't gather together, and I should. So if anyone can find different answers, different notes that the Rebbe said how to balance Shabbos Mevarchim, that's number 1. There are actual directions and instructions that, yes, include not learning the hour of Chassidus, the whole hour, and balancing the davening with the minyan and so on. And there is also the general common sense from many answers from the Rebbe, how he discusses about chitas and other things. So it comes down to not to become overly obsessed with exact minutes here. You look at a clock and say exactly an hour, not 59 minutes. Obviously, the Rebbe's writing is the general directive of how best to do it. But if a person, for whatever reason, is a slow Tehillim reader, well, you don't have to be felt inadequate to recognize, listen, you have to prioritize. So you say as much Tehillim as you can. You want to learn more Chassidus? Learn by all means more Chassidus. I was suggesting if you want to go further, so learn Chassidus a little shorter, but not in any way, if you can't do it all, you're anyway not going to fulfill all the directives of the Hayem Yem. So my suggestion is, do a part of all those directives instead of having to cut out something entirely. By simply doing something for less time. And the Tehillim can be finished later and so on. So I think it's also a general approach that I think we need to understand. When the Rebbe gives directives, obviously they are, for us, something that is not just an optional thing. However, you have to also be realistic. If a person has a difficulty, or for God forbid they're not well, or other reasons that they woke up late, which is fine, you can beat yourself up why you did that. It may not be the best approach and healthy approach of Chassidus. So what do? You're not going to do anything because you woke up late. You figure out to be practical. Want to talk to your mashpia to feel better about it by all means. Case by case. I'm not suggesting one size fits all. Be practical. Try to implement with the right dedication. The main thing here is, there's no question that if you ask the Rebbe, he wants your heart and soul to be connected to it and not to be so obsessed with the details of whether it's a little extra hour or a little less. So I was not saying 5 minutes as a directive. It was a practical suggestion, if you indeed crunch for time, what to do. And I think this should be applied to everything that we hear. Obviously, you have to learn to become confident that to make such decisions, maybe you need to have a mashpia or someone that's more objective that can help you decide that it shouldn't be based on it should be based on an objective and healthy advice. However, at the same time, the key thing is to remember is not to beat ourselves up over these things. We have to do it all b'simcha v'tuv le'vav in a positive way, and not to become overly obsessed with all the details, and then we end up not doing it properly or not doing it with the right spirit. And that's something that overall, with all minhagim and all directives, and in each case, the Torah does not ask us to do something that we don't have the power to do. The Rebbe wouldn't ask us to do something we don't have the power to do. That means we can figure out a method how to work it all in. Now let's move to a question. Interestingly, this question really should have been addressed last week or 2 weeks ago before Parsha Emer. It's a question on the Parsha Emer, which was 2 weeks ago, Emer Bahar Bechukosai. But it's a relevant question, and I decided to tackle it. And this is one of the places where you see literally the revolution of Chassidus. The revolution of Chassidus in approaching a very real and painful subject, and also one that can be prone to much misunderstanding and controversy. And that's the topic of what we'll call physical disabilities. Okay, so here's the question, and then some variations of it that different people wrote. In Parshas Emer, I'll give the chapter and verse, chapter 21, Psukim 17 to 23. We read how physically blemished, crippled or impaired priests, Kohanim, are prohibited from serving in the Holy Temple. And it becomes actually a lav, more than one lav. Now, lav means something that you're not allowed to do, which includes not just blemishes or scars or wounds or impairments that one is born with, which is like a mum, what he calls kavua, what halacha calls mum kavua, a permanent mum, a permanent wound, or permanent blemish, but even mum aver, one that is only temporary. And all that's forbidden for a priest that has any of that to enter into, to serve in the Holy Temple. How do we reconcile this with the fact that the soul is always pure? Which we always say, about special children or others, we always say, no matter what the external may be, the soul is always pure. The shamash and the satabi, tahirihi, pure. And how do we reconcile it with the innate compassion of a loving Torah, called Torah's chesed, a Torah of kindness? All its paths are, all its roads are pleasant, and all its paths are peaceful. As the Rambam paskins at the end of Laws of Chanukah, the Torah was given only to bring peace in the world. And peace includes, in other words, it's a loving, compassionate, benevolent Torah. And how does it stem? This question is especially pronounced in the current backdrop of our society's admirable attitude to the physically impaired, as reflected in many of today's laws. like the USA Americans with Disabilities Act, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. If humans are that sensitive, how can it be that the divine Torah, which is the epitome and embodiment of kindness, bars a priest with God-given imperfections, even temporary ones, from serving in the temple, in the Beis HaMikdash? An excellent question. So the verse says very clearly, yes, as I just cited, but the verse in the Psukim to give the exact pasuk, as I said, chapter Dabar al Arna Lemer, Ish Mizarechu l'Deirosim, Ashiyeh Baimum l'Yikarev l'Hakriv Lechem Alikov. And then he goes on to detail it, which mumim, which wounds and blemishes and which impairments and so on. And then again, Kol Ish Asher Baimum Mizera Arna Kein l'Yigash l'Hakriv es Ishei Hashem. Mum Boy es Lechem Alikov l'Yigash l'Hakriv. Repeated. Lechem Alikov Mekotche HaKadoshim Umin HaKadoshim Yoichel Achal HaPereches LaYovei V'al HaMizbeach LaYigash Kimum Boy V'lo Yechalas Mikdoshe Ki Ani Hashem Mikatsham. Basically translated that yes, you can eat from the korbanos, but you cannot bring an offering. Al HaPereches, you should not come to the curtain where the offerings were made to the Mizbeach because of the mum. So it's an excellent question. And how does one answer this? Of course, this feeds into the impression that the Torah is insensitive, and some will say, quote unquote, God forbid, primitive. But as we said, we address all questions here, and I'll address it. So there's actually a mimer from the Alter Rebbe, which was said, Leil Shabbos Kedesh Parsha Vayeshev, Tov Kuf Samach Vov. That would be the equivalent, that would be comparable to the year Tov Kuf Samach Vov would be Samach is the year Tov Kuf Ayin is I'm running a blank. I'm sorry about that. 1812 is when the Alter Rebbe passed away. It's Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel. So 10 years before that would be 1802. So Tov Kuf Samach Vov would be 1806. 1806. So that Leil Shabbos Kedesh was customary for the Alter Rebbe those years to say every Friday night, he said a maimer in addition to a maimer on Shabbos, that he would explain a Zoyar. And he explains a very interesting, fascinating, and amazing Zoyar of Parsha Vayeshev that addresses this topic very directly. And the Alter Rebbe's inimitable style and approach really enlightens us in this whole thing in ways that would be quite surprising. And I'll try to sum it up, but first let me give you the sources, and then I'll sum up briefly, but you can look it up in detail. So I said the Maimer was said then, and it's an explanation of Zohar Parsha Vayeshev, Kuf Pei Aleph Aleph, that's Zohar Volume 1, 181a. And the Zohar begins there, Rab Shimon Posach Achel HaPareches LeYovei Kimum Boy. Exactly this verse that I just read from this chapter. Now, the Alter Rebbe, as we know, did not write his own discourses, so we have, number one, Hanoche, which means a written transcript from the Mittler Rebbe, which is printed in Mamori Admur Azok on page Tovkuf Samach Vov that year, page 174. It's also printed in Admur Azok on Shas and Zeir, page 215, the same Aimer. Then we also have Anocha from the Mittler Rebbe's brother, the Alter Rebbe's son, Rab Moshe, which is printed in that same volume, Tovkuf Samach Vov, page 189 and on. And it's also fascinating to see the comparison, how each one wrote down the same Maimer. General ideas, but a little different order, different details. You also have in Biyuri Azeir, which the Mittler Rebbe published, which is the explanations of the Alter Rebbe on the Zeir, many of them from these Friday nights. In the beginning of Parsha Vayeshev, you have a summary as well of this idea. Then you have a summary and a kitzur and additions, fascinating additions from the Tzemach Tzedek and Biyuri Hazeir of the Tzemach Tzedek in the beginning of Parsha Vayeshev, page 135. And finally, which many of you may be familiar with, is Sefer HaMitzvahs, Derech Mitzvah Secher from the Tzemach Tzedek. There's a mitzvah, Isur Avedis Balmum, B'knisosei Lehechel, this prohibition of a priest not allowing entering into the Hechel, into the temple, the Mishkan, the Hechel, and then later into the Beis HaMikdash. Page 31a and on. And you have more about this topic, about mum in general, about blemishes and wounds, they're all really gathered in Sefer Lekutim from the Tzemach Tzedek and the Erech Mum, which has in many more additional details. So those are the sources and grounding what I'm going to be saying now there. So the Alter Rebbe, and these are my morim, and I'm just, as I said, this will be a short summary, begins by quoting the Zohar. The Zohar asks a very fascinating question, a very important question. Why do people suffer in this world? He's talking Vayeshev, of course, is Yaakov Avinu, Bikush Yaakov Leishav B'Shalva. Yaakov wanted to be at peace. After all, he went through with Esav, with Lavan, and so on. And then, of course, Yosef is ripped away from him. So this is the segue that the Zohar takes in that chapter to discuss why do some tzaddikim, and why do some people, you can say, in general, suffer. Not all, but some. And the Zohar goes through different various explanations and says perhaps the reason is that maybe because the tzaddik is not a ben tzaddik. If it was a ben tzaddik, he wouldn't suffer. And then he says, but one second, we have tzaddikim that are ben tzaddik. Yaakov was the son of Yitzchak, and others as well. So that the Zohar negates. And then the Zohar continues to explain and says actually one of the rare statements, rare times you find the Zohar says that I saw in early books, that's the expression there, in early writings, and that needs to be looked into, what are the early writings the Zohar is referring to, that the answer is connected to the mystery of the diminishing moon. What's called in Kabbalah, in Zohar, and later in the Eitz Chaim and other Kabbalah, is called Pgam HaLavana. The wound, the Pgam is like the wound of the sun, of the moon, which of course relates to the fact that on the fourth day when God created the sun and the moon, so the moon, the Gemara says in Chulin, a famous Gemara that says the moon, they were both powerful forces, Shnei HaMe'eres HaGdelim, two large luminaries, and the moon came complaining to God and said, you can't have a king with two crowns. So God said, if that's the case, you go diminish yourself. Lech matati asayireh. Go, you go diminish yourself. And from then on, the moon became a diminished luminary that would go through wax and wane, much weaker than the sun, and would go through a point of waxing and waning until it would completely disappear, only to be reborn again. So this is a basis in Kabbalistic thought, and in general in Torah, the miyut halavon, the pagam halavon. And then, of course, there's the Gemara continues, that's why it comes on Rish Chedesh, when there's the moiled halavon and the moon is reborn, you bring a special carbon in the time of the temple. The Eibishter says, Heviu alai kapora, bring a kapora for me. A type of atonement for me causing you, the Levana, for causing the Levana to be blemished and hurt and diminished. So this is all, around this comes the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe. And of course, one of the questions the Alter Rebbe asked, that the Zohar does not explain, Rab Shimon begins with the pasuk from Pasha Emer, that a Balmum, someone who has a blemish, who has a wound, or has an impairment, should not serve in the temple, and he never explains it. He goes off to talk about souls and the blemishes of the moon and so on. So all this is part of the discussion of the discourse. And what is the answer? So in other words, the question really is a bigger question. It's not whether a Baal Mum can go into the temple. The bigger question is, why is there a Baal Mum in the first place? Why do people suffer? Why are some people born with physical impairments? Why a good God, a kind God, would allow something like that? So the question then broadens, why would a caring and emphatic and empathetic God allow for children to be born with disabilities or for adults to suffer in one way or another? That's the key question here. Another question is, interestingly, if you really think about it, when you look at the verse, it says, but they will eat from the karbanos. If there's some type of discrimination going on, why are they allowed to eat from it? And the Torah makes it very clear that eat, yes, but you shall not approach the pareches. You shall not approach the curtain. You shall not approach the altar, the mizbeach. And a fascinating, I would say revolutionary discourse that I cited before, the sources, the Alter Rebbe explains it. Really, to do justice requires learning it inside yourself, but I'll try to sum it up to the best of my ability and hopefully accurately convey the power of the point of the Alter Rebbe. So based on the Zohar, it comes down to this, that God created a world with a purpose. And the purpose is to transform a material world that is imperfect and turn it into a divine home. As we know, Dira b'tachtenim. I'm giving a little extra explanation before we get into the exact mimer. So not everything I'm saying is from that mimer, but the mimer implies what I've just said. To do that, in the language of Kabbalah, the Malchus of Atzilus has to be yedid in biyah, which means in simple English that the divine forces have to come down to a place that are not so divine, and more concealment, and be affected by that in order for them to engage with this material world. So think of it like the soul descending into a physical world, coming from a spiritual place where there's no pain, there's no wounds, there's no mum, there's no blemishes, there's no impairments. But it has to come into an imperfect world, which is a painful experience. That's why you have to compel the soul to come into this world. And the purpose is not to make it suffer, for it to transform existence, a imperfect existence, and turn it into a perfect world, which will happen when Mashiach comes. As such, Malchus enters into Biyah. It has to go through what he calls a milchama atzuma, a tremendous war, because you're entering into enemy territory. You're entering into a materialistic, selfish universe, which we don't need much evidence for. It's pretty obvious, and trying to in some way sublimate it, tame it, and turn it into something more divine. So it's a milchama atzuma. And such wars are difficult to the point, as he speaks in Derech Mitzvah, he brings from some Sefer al-Gilgulim from the Arizal, that this milchama atzuma is difficult because the negative forces subconsciously or unconsciously know that their whole sustenance is based on the holy sparks. So they fight for their life, because if the sparks are taken from them, they will cease to be. So you have a true war, explained in Tanya, obviously, zelu umazeh, a real war. And when there's a war, there are casualties. And then he brings a fascinating example. And all this is explaining the Zohar. And I'll get back to the Zohar in a minute. He gives a fascinating example. He says, one of the tachsisei milchama, one of the strategies in war strategies is that when you're fighting a war and you want to draw out the enemy, to be able to conquer the enemy, sometimes you have to take a loss or two. You have to enter into enemy territory, draw the enemy out, and as a result, you may get hurt. There will be a casualty or two. And the whole purpose is that the enemy should be drawn out, then you can surround it and conquer it. The different versions of the Maimarim, this example is used in different ways, but basically that's the gist of it. As a result, there are souls that will be hurt and will be blemished and will have mumim in this world. Why? Not because that's the purpose. The purpose is in order to draw out the enemy and then conquer the enemy, and then he continues until the day when the moon is renewed, and then those people who had that suffering will reach levels of perfection that those that didn't suffer as much can never reach, because they, in a sense, had that Mesiras Nefesh. So what does he say now, explaining the Zohar? The Zohar says the reason says that the people that in this world have a pagam in some way or another, and this can refer to any type of weakness which we all suffer from. Some have physical, some have it's mental, some can be emotional, so in other ways, is a result of the moon's pain and suffering. So it's not a punishment, it's a reflection of reality that we don't live in a perfect world. So this is not going to get into the mystery of why God chooses some people to suffer more than others. I'm not here to explain that. That remains in God's domain, and we humans cannot understand it. But we can understand why there is the concept of imperfection, because it's a reflection of the moon's imperfection. But the purpose of it is not imperfection. The purpose of it is to enter an imperfect world and identify with it in order to extract those sparks, in this battle, those sparks, in order to be able to elevate them to a greater place. So what he says in the Zohar is an interesting thing. He says, these souls are intimate partners. Achai v're'ai, they're like brothers and friends, and partners with the moon. And just as the moon suffers, they suffer. And just as the moon will be renewed, that the moon will be renewed, especially when Mashiach comes, when the Levana will become like the moon, the sun again, and even greater because it suffered. They too, because they suffered together with the moon, they also will be renewed together with it. Because then will come the point where the war will be finished, and any casualty incurred will now become transformed into a positive force. That's the essence of the Zohar. And as I said, it's brief what I'm saying, and it requires a lot more discussion. So then the Alter Rebbe goes back and explains, these Maimarim, now he goes back to explain the Psukim in Emer. He says the following. This blemish that they have, that any soul has in this world, is only chitzenius. It's only on the outer dimension. It's not, God forbid, the neshama. That's what the Zohar says, that the begam is only on the outer dimension, like on the skin, the flesh, not on the inner. And that's why it says absolutely these Kohanim, even though they are priests and servants of God that have an outer blemish, but they absolutely eat from it. As the Pasuk says, Lechem elikov, mikach kedoshim, min ha-kadoshim, amin ha-kadoshim, yeichel. They absolutely eat from it. Why? Because their premises are intact. So who cares that their external has a blemish? Their premises is there, their inner soul is intact, and therefore the karbonis, which they eat, which is also mechaper, and atones for the people, for the bailim, for the people who brought these offerings, that absolutely is complete. But since there's a part of the temple that has the chitzenias, which is going to the mizbeach and the pareches, that's already an external dimension. An external dimension, there is a blemish and there is a wound connected to the cosmic and existential wounds of existence in general. There, if they would then bring an offering there would be unikas achitzenim and can cause harm and damage. In one of the Rav Moshe's Hanocha, he says that therefore pnimius can bring to chitzenis, but you can't bring the chitzenis into the pnimius in a world like ours. So it's not, God forbid, a discrimination. It's a reflection of reality that you have to be wise. For example, when you're fighting a war and somebody is wounded, you're not going to take that wounded person and say, go ahead, continue fighting. That person has to be protected, as well as the rest of the army has to be protected. So once there is an incurred wound, which is reflective of the existential wound of the moon, as I described, then that person is best not to be involved in the external dimension. The prima is nothing changed, and the neshama is intact. So they eat from the karbonis, but they're bringing the offering, which is connected to continuing the battle, because the korban is birur, what he calls the birur rishon, of tackling and fighting with the evil, with fighting with the negative. There's too much vulnerability. So it's actually the sensitivity of the Torah of protecting. And what we learn from this is that the blemishes, and this is not a justification, the blemishes are not seen as something wrong. They're seen as reflection of the reality. And you need to protect it when you're dealing with this middle of this battle. And that's why Haviyah like kapara. Why kapara? God told it to diminish the moon. There was a reason for it. At the end of the day, even this external blemish, God regrets. And he needs to have a kapara. Even Kavyochel the Eibishter says, atone for me for causing the pain, even momentary pain, even external pain, to the moon and to all those souls that are moon connected and are connected to being born or even having a temporary type of wound. And that's why in the Shchedish we're reminded of the purpose that the moon will be reunited with the sun. Because what's the Shchedish? Is where you have the moon and the sun begin their relationship again, leading to the full moon. And that's why we bring that korban time of the Beis Hamikdash to atone, because even that external and momentary pain, God also wants atonement for. That's the gist of it. As I said, much more to be said about it. I want to just add one more thing, that Tzemach Tzedek brings a Gemara in Chagigah, where it talks about crying, whether there's tears in heaven. So the Gemara says, we know that the Shekhinah does not rest where there's a place where there's pain. And tears. Why do we find in some places you do find tears or pain in heaven? So he says an interesting thing. The Gemara says, in the inner chambers there can be elements of pain and tears. But varoi, which is the outer chambers of the king, you can't have that. So Tzemach Tzedek and B'Yireh Hazeh equates it with this idea that when you go into the inner chambers, it's a pure place. That's why you could eat from the korban, because there it transcends the blemishes. But in the outer chambers, there you have to be very careful. You have to continuously be in a joyous state, and that's why you don't want to subject somebody who's been in a place in any compromised way, because there could be a nikas achitzeim, there can be the power of others grabbing. That's why there has to be joy in the outer chamber, not in the inner. This again, something to look up. Anybody can look up, and I gave more sources which discussed this more at length. I said, I hope I did some justice to this. It's not a simple topic, but bottom line, what I want to really emphasize is that it's a tremendous explanation from the Alter Rebbe, and a compassionate one. And he concludes by saying, why is it therefore the Zohar, Rab Shimon just begins the pasuk? Because it's obvious that the connection of the moon's wound is the same idea as the mum of the wounds of the Kohanim. I would also add that Tzemach Tzedek refers to Sefer HaChinuch as he usually does in Derech Mitzvah, where he brings on each mitzvah the reasons of the mitzvah, and this also enriches the reason in the chinuch. The chinuch talks about the external, that when someone who's not in the perfect type of picture, like the Tzelem Elokim of God, can affect how things are served in the Beis HaMikdash. But this you could see as discrimination. Discrimination at someone that do not have a physical perfect appearance. But he also hints to that it's also connected to the what he calls here the shleimus tzuros remez linyanim shemetech machshavas ha'adam behem. So it looks like also referring to the image of the divine image that a human being is aligned with. Again, this is something you can look up that Tzemach Tzedek alludes to, brings it at the beginning of his Maimer in Derech Mitzvah. I will definitely elaborate more on this if it wasn't explained enough. And if you have any questions, please send them in. And I hope I answered all the questions regarding this topic. What I find, just on a concluding note in this, is the tremendous compassion that this is not coming to explain, definitely not coming to discriminate. What it does is it comes us to understand the compassion, that you understand that imperfections in this world, whether it's individual or it's collective, are part of the bigger picture of existence. So any of us who suffer in some way or another, not that this is a consolation, but remember, it's part of the same question of why existence is not perfect. So suffering is a very big part of this world. We're coming to a point where we're told and promised that it's almost all over. And we'll come to a point where Mashiach will come and we'll all be erased. Not just erased, but we'll understand Eit Hashem can have to be how all be transformed. But it also teaches us the sensitivity we need to have. So when you see someone who, God forbid, is suffering in some way, someone who has a blemish, someone who has even a physical impairment or other things similar, to look at them and understand that they're connected to the same blemish when you look up into the sky at the moon. And the blemishes of tzaddikim through the generations that carried in some way that cosmic imperfection, with the goal of us ultimately all in this battle, finally winning the battle and eliminating any casualties and any wounds and any pains. But this does not necessarily make it easier, but it makes it understandable more that why this world is such a bizarre world and why there is sometimes seemingly senseless pain, senseless suffering, and gives it the purpose, that there is an understanding of how it's connected to the whole purpose of existence and the repair of an imperfect world. Okay. Let's move to a completely unrelated, a separate topic, and that is, you speak often about the need to channel our passions correctly to healthy directions, lest they lead us to dangerous places. But how and who is to decide what are healthy and appropriate channels? What does constructive passion look like? Some feel passion should be channeled towards announcing the Rebbe as Mashiach, while others feel it should be channeled towards demonstrating against Zionists. While we are told that Torah and sages are what determine the appropriateness of our passions, everyone believes that they are interpreting the Torah correctly. How can we talk about channeling passion properly if not everyone agrees on the definition of the word properly? An excellent question. And that's why we have a Torah that says, Sheichid ya'avra einei chachamim, bias, bribery, blinds the eyes of the wise, v'yisalif, and distorts the tongue of tzaddikim, of the righteous. And that's why I say l'charav. That's why you need to have a mentor. And that's why you need to have a rav. And that's why you need someone that you can consult halachically if it's a halachic question. Because we are not objective. There are definitely, someone says, for example, I put my passion in learning Torah. I think that pretty much obvious. Everyone will understand that that's a great way to channel your passion. But if it's a passion to something, let's say a cause, that some will say maybe it's not a healthy way to channel the passion. Maybe yes, it's maybe better than a passion and, God forbid, some addiction. But who says this is the right place to put it? Of course. We're living in a world today where we see so-called Muslim terrorists in the name of religion, with all the passion doing things that are very destructive. So it's very clear that passion is not by per se always a correct, being directed in the correct way, like a fire. So how do you know? You know by, number one, following what the Torah says, where one should put passion and where not. When you have a doubt, you ask somebody that's objective, because you may, with all good intentions, think it's going in the right place, and maybe it's not. And there are neutral places to put passion: music, art, reading, traveling, and so on. But ultimately, we want our passion to be an energy that's inside the soul, which is what I always talk about, directing it toward very positive goals that change and improve the world and fulfilling our life's mission, which is the best preemptive and preventive medicine to dealing with to where passion ends up in the wrong and destructive places. So the best defense is offense, especially today. And I say this again and again and again, especially for our children. The best medicine possible, preventive medicine, is not to wait till there's a problem. The passion that our children have, find their passion. Connect it to something holy, to something meaningful, something constructive. It's the best possible thing you can do for your children and for ourselves. And to determine that, if there's a doubt, the Torah tells us ways to determine it. That's my response. Okay. Next question. What's the secret to aging gracefully and with dignity? How do we deal with the loneliness that comes along with growing old? My children are grown up and my house is silent. What should I do about the hours of isolation and loneliness that suddenly hit me in the middle of the day? What's the secret of growing old with dignity despite the loneliness that becomes routine? Thank you for your stimulating lectures. So we have a series of sichos directly addressing this from the Rebbe in the beginnings of the Mem Aleph, actually. Chof Av Tov Mem Aleph. In that period of time, the Rebbe talked about the established Teferes Skenim Levi Yitzchak, both for men and for women who are of age, what you call the entering an age of, or what some people call retirement, even though I'll mention in a moment, retirement is not acceptable from the Rebbe's point of view, but entering an age where, let's put it, it's physically slowing down, have more time, their children out of the home, as you put it. And the Rebbe directly addressed this. You could say even actually addressed it personally 9 years earlier, when he turned 70, the Rebbe, in Shnas HaShivim, Yud Aleph Nisan, when the Rebbe turned 70 years old, Tavshin Lamed Beis, 1972, and said he's receiving letters congratulating for a happy birthday and encouraging to now slow down and retire. You've done so much. People are writing to the Rebbe quoted, now you can slow down. The Rebbe said, and spoke the whole Farbrengen in the letter Michtav Klali for Pesach. Adam Lami Yavolet. A person is not defined by their age on the passport, the Rebbe said. A human being was created to la'amel, to toil, to exert, to pay effort. There's changes how we do that. Obviously, a person who's in a stronger, is physically stronger, so a certain type of chores. And someone older has more wisdom, has more experience, has more seasoning. And the Rebbe then, especially in the Mem Aleph and on, spoke about the tremendous waste of resources and talents, where we live in a society that worships youth, worships the young, and sees older people as a liability, forced retirement, and so on. So besides what it's doing for those people, the demoralization for those that are being forced out and not being respected, and the Rebbe says society is suffering because you have people who, trial and error, have tremendous amount of seasoning and experience. And what kind of brain trust you have, if you're able to access that, an advisory position in consultation and so on. And we're not talking here really from a religious point of view. This is a tremendously psychological insight about the human being. So the first thing is you have to remember the body ages, the soul does not age. The soul only gets younger. Because the more experience it has, the more wisdom it has, the more vibrant and more vitality it has. If you look at the chapter in Torah Meaningful Life, my book, the chapter on aging and retirement, I sum up the Rebbe's approach to it, and it's a tremendous chapter for this topic. Because it's exactly the point. We can easily succumb, emotionally, psychological, in our attitudes, to age and say, I'm aging, I can't move so quickly, can't run so quickly, I have this problem, that problem. Or you can embrace it that this is another stage of your shlichus in this life. A different stage. And now, yes, advice, counsel, sage advice, the experiences you've had for your children, grandchildren, strangers. And when a person sees themselves as God's messenger in this world, what difference does it make if you're a messenger at 20 or 30 or 80 or 90? And the Rebbe was a living example of this. The hours he stood by dollars. All the excuses you could say, the Rebbe is not physically young any longer. But that was not the point. You're on a mission. And the best solution, antidote to everything you write, the loneliness, grace, and dignity, is all to do with the sparkle in the eye of a person, a man or woman who knows they're connected to God's purpose and God's mission. And that mission does not get weaker. If anything, it gets stronger. And every day that God blesses us with more life and to fulfill, it means that it's a vote of confidence that He wants us here. We say, Moida ani lefanecha, just like we say when we're age 1, we say it when we're age 100. Thank you for returning my soul to me, continuing and a vote of confidence, renewing my contract and fulfilling my mission in this world. And we are absolutely indispensable. Like I always say, birth is God saying you matter, and that's a fact throughout a person's life. And the more you demonstrate your contribution, the more life and health God will give you to fulfill it. God forbid, when a person starts succumbing to demoralization or resignation, in a sense you're telling God, I'm giving up. So what are you saying basically? I can't do the job anymore. So God should still bless you if you say that, God forbid. But imagine if you go and say, what are you talking about? I have plenty to do with my life. I have much to contribute. Teach. And you see people thriving in some of these Teferes Kenim Levit, so they learn, their minds are stimulated, they're alive instead of sitting and waiting to die, God forbid. And with the word retirement is retiring from life, God forbid. So you can look up those talks, and that's the response to that question. Next question. Is there a difference between adults and children using Facebook? I have a Facebook account. I have the app on my phone. I use it mainly for Hafatzas Hamayonas purposes, spreading Chassidus. My 10-year-old son insists that I delete it. He feels that it's a waste of time and inappropriate. How should I deal with this? Okay, well, this gets into the whole subject of technology in general. So firstly, let's establish a few things here. You know what? I'm going to read the next series of questions because it's all connected. Television versus unrestricted internet. What is the difference between TV and unrestricted internet? The Rebbe adamantly advised against having televisions at home. Is this at all different to unrestricted internet? When discussing the idea of having children exposed to non-kosher things, you mentioned the Rebbe's adamant position about not having a television at home. What would you say would be his approach to having a computer with unfiltered internet at home? I tried explaining this to my husband numerous times, and that I don't see the difference. But he keeps on telling me he really needs the internet and is not willing to give it up. Okay. This has to be addressed from two angles. Let's start with the angle exactly what the point is. Yes, especially for our children and also for us adults. You want to have the purest possible environment in your life to have a fighting chance to deal with this complicated world. So from the youngest of age, we surround our children when they were born with letters, holy letters of Torah. We bring them shvuos to Seres HaDibros, as the Rebbe explains, because the impact on young life, when they were impressionable, like a warm ball of wax, is tremendous, and you want purity. And there'll be plenty of unfortunate situations where people will be exposed to impurity. So the more you reinforce and bolster this exposure of holiness, the better. And this includes, of course, technology and Facebook and everything as well, and television. I don't see any difference. The holier environment of your home should be like a base of Mishkan. Your home is the Mishkan, is your Mishkan. Why would you defile it with outside forces and influences? That would be the simple approach to anyone with a straight mind and understands the world. We're not being naive here, and so on. So as long as you can maintain that, maintain it. Now, of course, the question is practical. Children start going to school. They have friends that maybe have in their home some other things, and they go and they have a play date with them, or they spend time with them, or even sleep over. Then they start seeing others have it, and of course, as we grow into adults, can someone exist without a mobile phone? In most people's mind. The truth is that perhaps if a person would really wanted to be adamant about it, you probably could protect yourself as much as possible. But let's be realistic, quote unquote, and it's not that simple. But the more years that you have under the belt of that type of pure environment, trust me, this will be served very well when you deal with the rest. Because then comes the time, it's not just technology and Facebook and internet, in life in general, there's a point where your children start leaving. And let's say your home is the best, perfect, the holiest home possible. They will enter into the street one day. They will go to school. They will have friends. And this is long before the internet or technology, let's say 200 years ago. So what are you doing? You're enforcing and you're giving them the strength to deal with the challenges. As I spoke before about Malchus, Yeridus Malchus and Biyah, the Yeridus Neshama Beguf, the soul, and going into a world that is not perfect. That's life. But that's why we empower as much as possible. Now, when they enter that world, what do you want to teach them? Don't be afraid of the world. Now that you're empowered, recognize everything in this world, even things that sometimes are used for the wrong thing are created because God didn't create anything for no reason. And everything He created, He created l'chveide, including electricity, including technology. That doesn't mean, however, that you have to expose children earlier to it because God created it. Not everything God created you have to expose to someone to. Then when they have that attitude and they're from the earliest of age have that approach of being on the offense, then okay, technology, you have it, it comes your way, use it for the right purpose. It's not for business or entertainment is the main purpose. The purpose is to spread godliness. So that's the first statement. And television, internet's all the same category, or radio, they're all the same. The only thing is internet is more available today and more mobile. But it's neutral. Technology is neutral, like the kitchen knife example that Rebbe gives. You use it for good things, you cut a challah. Use it, God forbid, the wrong way, you could hurt somebody. Like fire. Fire can be the source of life, fire can be damaging. That's the attitude. As far as a home, the holier the better. Is there a difference between children and adults? Frankly, there's no difference. Everyone has a same Torah, same God, and everyone should be surrounded with Kedusha. The only difference is that an adult you can't control, and parents can somewhat control the environment of their children. That's one difference. The second difference is hopefully an adult is mature enough and is wise enough to not be succumb and be seduced by these forces and understand them as being part of the purpose of existence and using them for that purpose. So, practically speaking, at the time, the age where your children begin to discuss this, maybe this is what you, not maybe, you should have a discussion about it. What is the purpose of technology? Why do we have these things? Facebook, per se, is not necessarily a place of Kedusha. But are people hanging out there? Yes, there are many people hanging out there. And there are many from people hanging out there. I'm not going to give an endorsement for something which not necessarily should get an endorsement. But once you're there already, use it for holy purposes. This is what we should be talking with our children. But it's not a lechatchila thing. It's not like, okay, let's embrace it all, let's take it all, let's turn it to Kedusha. Embrace God, embrace Torah, embrace mitzvahs, learn Chassidus, surround yourself with holiness, and when these things come your way, find ways to deal with it, just like when the day comes that you learn how to drive a car or ride a bicycle. These are part of the tools of this world. Make sure you use them, divrei reshus, for Kedusha. The whole basis of Tanya, the beginning of Tanya, that it's like food and drink. Food and drink you can indulge and use it in a very negative way and for destructive purposes, the energy that you gain from it, or you can use it for healthy purposes. So this is the general take on this topic, and due to time, I will now move to the next, to the question of Chassidus, and there are some topics I will move to the next week, so because we didn't have time to get to them. So the Chassidus question of the week is in Likutei Torah on this week's Parsha, which is Bechukosai, 48b to be precise. The Alter Rebbe explains that the curses in this week's Parsha of Bechukosai are actually hidden kindness. Chassodim nistorim. Can you please elucidate this idea in plain English? Okay, very good question. So I will do so, but I also want to refer you to an article I wrote, and if you go to meaningfullife.com, search for Kabbalah of curses, and you'll find this article. I'm going to sum up briefly in answering this question with those sources. So what does the Alter Rebbe speak there? He speaks there, of course, Parshas Bechukosai has the 49 curses. Klolos, we call them. When we read them lower. The Teichacha, you don't give an aliyah, the Balked himself gets called up without fanfare and so on. There are three Parshas of the Torah that have a Teichacha, Bechukosai, Dvarim, and Kisaveh. Now, in Bechukosai, the Alter Rebbe explains that it's really chassodim nistorim. That Tzemach Tzedek in his gloss or Hagah on Likutei Torah connects it with the story in Moed Katan Daf Ches, where he talks about Rashbi, who sent Rabbi Elazar to be blessed by the sages, and it's a very bizarre story because Rabbi Elazar comes back, instead of getting a blessing, he tells his father that they cursed me. I'm not even going to repeat what they told him. He was shocked. So then Rabbi Shimon said, no, what did they tell you? And he explained what they told him. Rabbi Shimon said, reassured them, all their words are really, kol hana bracha hatninu. They're all really blessings. And he explained how each one was a blessing. So the obvious is very nice, but the obvious question everyone asks is, So why didn't they just bless him in the first place? Why did they have to say it in a cryptic way and depend on Reb Shimon's interpretation? So you have 4 basic answers in Nigla. One is the sages did so to challenge and sharpen Rabbi Elazar. Mashal says that. Another was to honor Reb Shimon, that he be the one that interprets and blesses his son. In effect, Rabbi Elazar would be blessed twice in that sense. That's the Ian Yankov and the Rif say that. A third answer is a blessing is more effective when it isn't pronounced out loud in public. That's again the Ian Yankov. And finally, they did so for Rabbi Elazar's good because they saw in his future negative things. So they decided to use the words, negative words, with a good intention. In a sense, transforming and bypassing fooling the prosecuting angels because the angels don't read our thoughts. Who says this? The Nezer HaKedesh cited in Eitz Yosef. But still, it still does not fully answer why they couldn't have said it in a fully blessed way. So the Alter Rebbe's answer, according to Tzemach Tzedek's interpretation, is because there are 2 types of blessings that we receive in our lives. There are conscious ones, and we'll call others super-conscious ones. There are ones that are confined in containers that we all can relate to. But what happens if God wants to give you a blessing that's beyond the structure or the containers that a person has the capacity to relate to? Think of a teacher who wants to convey an idea to a student beyond the student's current capability. The only way to do it is do it in a cryptic way, to do it in a hint, to say something, plant a seed that years later the student will understand. Because at this point the student's conscious faculties and conscious containers cannot relate to it. That's chassodim nustarim. So when the Torah, which is Torah's chesed, as I elaborated earlier, tells us something that sounds negative, it may be on an external level negative, but we know that later in the Parshas Bechukosai, the Tzemach Tzedek interprets it all in a positive way. Eicha even, he interprets everything in a positive way. This doesn't mean that it can be taken in a negative way, but it means the negative is the outer shell. It's like the outer experience. And you have many times where you find that sometimes something happens in a person's life that right now it doesn't look positive. The person is fired. Just recently I heard somebody was fired. And it was very devastating because they were there for many years working. And just now, just a few days ago, an opportunity came. They would never have had this opportunity because they were working there. They wouldn't even have listened to this opportunity. The opportunity is far better and more appropriate. So there's the momentary setback, which really is a hidden chesed. Now, of course, God could have maybe done it a different way, but that's how it's done. So the only way to do it is the guy had to be fired because there's no other way. It wouldn't have been receptive. Now, do we always see? We don't always see it. If we're blessed, we see sometimes in life things evolve and you realize the blessings that were once seen by you as a negative. But chassodim nustarim is more intense. That's why it can't be revealed. It's not God is trying to hide it and fool us or we should be ingenious. It's because the intensity is so strong it cannot be consciously perceived. And this is not an uncommon thing in people's lives. It also forces us to widen our horizons, broaden our horizons and broaden our perspectives, lift our sights, and recognize there's a bigger picture. And sometimes when you're low down and you're standing on the ground or in a valley, you don't see the bigger picture. So everything ultimately is leading to a better and more positive place, as I spoke earlier about the wounds and Mun, which incidentally goes back to what I spoke a few weeks ago about Rabbi Yisrael Aryeh Leib. The Rebbe actually brings the Derech Mitzvah about the Balmum in that Sikha, Yutes Ir, Tovshin Yud Beis, when the Rebbe stood up from Shiva for his brother. So he talks about Yerida and Aliyah, printed in Chelik Chov Zayin that I cited 2 weeks ago. He also brings that there are times where you have a setback, but it's only leading to a greater Aliyah, and it's also a matter of speed and how quickly, but overall everything is going toward perfection. And that's something we have to always know, that everything will be good at the end, and if it's not good, it means it's not yet the end. We're middle of the story. The Shvindel trap mashal of the Baal Shem Tov is very fitting. Spiral staircase. Right before you reach the destination, you turn your back to it, and you don't think you're there. You may suddenly stop. You must see it through, because you never know what's behind the curtain. You never know where it's leading to. And it's that attitude that we were trained by the Rebbe and by all the Rabbeim. You forge ahead with that absolute belief and strength and the promise that we will make it. And that's the key to all challenges. So the lesson from the Torah Discriminate is a tremendous one. It's not just Don't be disturbed by the curse. Understand that even sometimes that appears negative is really the deepest type of chesed, like Rabbi Lozer learned. And that's the blessing they gave him. They gave him a blessing that was far more than the capacity that he could have understood on his own. And Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, of course, Baal Hazeir, Primis HaTeirah, Mara the Primis HaTeirah, the person who taught us Primis HaTeirah, that reveals the Primis that's sometimes concealed on the outer dimension. Let's sum up, and let's conclude now with the 3 essays. Essay number 1, Self-Control from the Essence of Your Soul by Aryeh Gorowitz. You may recognize his name because he was the number 1 winner last year's essay contest. So Aryeh Gorowitz, and age 24, Teferes Bachurim, Lake Worth, Florida. Okay, and again, a very well done essay, takes Yechida, the concept of Yechida, and applies it to one of the most fundamental observations of Chassidus, that there's a conflict happening within each one of us. We all have inclinations that we know better than to act upon, but in the moment we sometimes feel that we lack control. We just can't help it. And he applies this to bad habits and emotions and even things that are truly dangerous. Taking a mimer from the Rebbe, Padav Shalom Tafshin Chav Beis, 1962, he analyzes the concept of Yechida and how Yechida can be applied to self-control. Very well done, very fascinating, very interesting in many ways, and how the sense of feeling I don't want to feel separated, which is what Yechida is, and it can't be any other way, can help us in our own self-control. Then he applies it to actual scenarios using Eish Ruach Mayim Ofer very creatively, anger, desire, ridicule, and laziness, and how we can use this Yechida idea as he annotates here as well annotated in this essay. This essay can be accessed if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, which is at meaningfullife.com, and as well as meaningfullife.com/essays or /contest, where you can see these essays as we continue to post them, as we summarize them each week. The next one is called Apathy, the Incurable Disease. Apathy. Yeah, very, very powerful title by Hadassah Silberstein. And by Hadassah Silberstein, a moment please. Where's Hadassah from? Just looking for my pages here. Okay, I'll have to look up where this person is from. I just don't want to. Age 23, a teacher in Brooklyn, New York. And as the title suggests, Apathy, the Incurable Disease, it's the challenge that makes every parent throw up their arms in defeat, is the question that the teacher is hoping no one will ask. Is the nagging voice in the back of our minds what holds us back from the changes we wish to make? What if I don't feel like doing this? What if I don't want to change? What if I just don't care? And the Torah tells a story about a cold, apathetic nation called Amalek, using Amalek and the Chassidus explanation of Amalek as apathy and the disease, and breaks it down into the symptoms. Symptom 1, cynicism. Symptom 2, rationalization. Symptom 3, resistance to change. And then uses Chassidus and Amalek how we can solve the apathetic attitude that sometimes plagues us like a disease. Okay, that's essay number 2. A wonderful essay, commend you for that. Finally, essay number 3 is Maternal Mental Illness, from Caregiver to Care Receiver, by Adam Zagoria Moffat, age 27, a student, rabbi, Oceanside Jewish Center, Oceanside, New York. And a very personal and heart-wrenching piece, talking about someone who's dealt with this issue, maternal mental illness, affected the family and everybody, and using a mimer from the Rebbe Rashab in Ayin Beis about Shukas HaMakabel, the receiver's desire, applies it to how both caregivers and care receivers, meaning people who suffer from this, can be benefited from the Chassidic concept of Bittul HaMakabel, or Shukas HaMakabel, I should say, and Bittul. I found this to be extremely original and very riveting in the sense of applying it to a real life situation. And hope nobody suffers from this, but this can tremendously be helpful to people who deal with this. And he uses quotes, "It may be that the desire of the receiver immediately awakens the descent and shrinking of the giver, and the receptacle will actually draw down what can be given, so much so that the receptacle will be revealed and the giving multiplied. But this can only occur when the abnegation of the individual makes it so that it will be a receptacle and thus will cause the giver to give." And applies this, as I said, both for the care receiver and for the caregiver in how to deal with challenges of this nature. So, what can I say? When you see Chassidus being applied to real situations like this and actually helping people in real case studies here, I don't see any more powerful way that demonstrates Chassidus applied in the fullest sense of the word. Okay, so as you can see, there's so much to talk about, there's so much more to talk about, and Mr. Hashem, we'll continue this journey together. So this has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 117, every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. Please send us your questions. Everyone should have a very blessed week, a blessed Chodesh Sivan, blessings both in our personal lives, collectively, and Bizeicha to the Gula Mitzvah Vashlema, what we call both personal redemption and collective and global redemption. Be well.